Well, we are going to move our agenda forward here and move to the country of Sudan, where there, of course, is a major ongoing crisis. I think 25 million people facing acute hunger, serious humanitarian crisis, ongoing civil war. And we are very happy to be joined here on the show once again by Mosaab Baba, who is a researcher on Sudan. Mosaab, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thank you, Rania, Eugene. Nice to be on here again.
Great to have you here. On the U.S. side of things, the United States just recently appointed a new special envoy to Sudan, and of course, that is being talked a lot about. And they're saying they want to play a role in, bringing peace and ending the conflict, and so on and so forth. But I guess my first question for you, in some ways, Mosaab, is can we actually expect the United States to be sort of an honest broker in this conflict, which is sort of the way they're kind of presenting themselves, the person coming from outside, who every side can sort of trust and work with?
It's a bit complicated with like the U.S. relationship with Sudan, and it goes back to like the 70s and the 80s, kind of having a closer relationship. But what's been happening in the past, maybe I'd say 10 years or so, the U.S. has kind of handed off the policy on Sudan to the kind of, quote unquote, the normalization countries, UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and stuff. So increasingly, they've been having less and less, leverage and influence, especially when it comes to the military and the militia, the paramilitary RSF forces. The kind of main problem, and I think when it came to this new envoy, was people were expecting him to report directly to Biden to kind of show the seriousness of this and show like some kind of commitment. But unfortunately, he's reporting to the same State Department people who've been running the show for the past few years. So we still don't know like how they're going to start working with Sudan. Like, are they going to pressure the UAE? Are they going to pressure, Egypt and stuff like that, or is it just going to be the regular stuff? Letting these countries kind of maintain their influence over the military and the RSF, and just kind of do some more fluff kind of diplomacy. Yes, we want a democratic transition and civilian government, and supporting some of the politicians, and not actually going to the root of the problem, which is the issue of the militarization, like of the entire government, of entire societies, of entire tribes. I mean, there's been a lot of atrocities. I mean, there's recent reports about like actual slavery happening in Darfur as a result of the RSF militia kind of just going wild without any checks. So people are still going to look at kind of what this new envoy would bring to the table, but again, like nobody's kind of holding their breath for the U.S. to come and exert the kind of pressure that's needed. I mean, because the pressure points where it's needed is entangled with other issues of Gaza and all of this stuff. So it's for U.S. policy, it's like there's always that element of trying to keep the status quo, but kind of changing the wrapping every time. How about this wrapping? Do you like this? And it's not. I don't see it kind of going anywhere. There is a lot of pressure on U.S. policies in the region, whether it's Gaza and by extension, the Houthis. And they're also afraid because Iran's been, supporting the military, especially recently. And like, the old school kind of Islamists, connecting back again with the kind of model that they were actually seeking, which is the Iranian model. So there's a lot of moving pieces, and it's a little bit difficult to get like a solid reading of where U.S. or Western policy in general is going to go. But in general, because the main problem, and I think why it prompted them to have an envoy, is because of the recent escalation. Within the past month, you've had increasing battles. You have a complete internet shutdown from the entire country. that crippled like localized humanitarian aid. It's crippling monetary transfers. It's crippling all this stuff. And in addition to that, like the RSF militia took advantage of the internet blackout, and they're like ravaging entire states right now. You know, like Jazeera State is directly south of Khartoum, and RSF has been going wild over there, you know, raiding one village after another. And it's like we don't hear it until somebody gets out of those areas into a place where there's, you know, somebody has a Starlink or something and is able to communicate what exactly is happening in those areas. So yeah, the people are, you know, following kind of the appointments and stuff like that, but like the reality on the ground just makes it a little bit difficult to kind of, you know, get a solid reading for what like a new U.S. envoy would mean.
And then there's an interesting dynamic that came to be a few weeks ago, or came to be known a few weeks ago, and that's the role of Ukrainian special forces being active in Sudan. The US, or not US, I should say, the international corporate mainstream media was portraying this as something almost like positive, and that the Ukrainian special forces were there to fight the Russian mercenaries from the Wagner group. That's how it was being portrayed. And I'm just curious if you can give us an understanding of how this other war has now somehow inserted itself into the war in Sudan.
Oh, that's been one of the most puzzling things. You know, there's been a lot of talk about Ukrainian forces coming and supporting the army and pushing back the RSF, you know, because the RSF had a relationship with the Wagner group and, you know, had some relations, you know, on and off with Moscow. But it's kind of, you know, urban legends slash ghost stories. Like we keep hearing about it, but never anywhere on the ground where that's actually transpiring. It's pretty odd, but I think because I think Russian policy has kind of changed after the war, and that's why it's so weird. Like, you know, taking out the head of Wagner and kind of pushing back a little bit on, like, the Russians have been, you know, backtracking a little bit on supporting militias in the region and stuff like that. And it seems like they're switching more towards supporting the military. So for the Ukrainians to come and jump in at a time like this, it's you know, I think it's more of a PR thing because of like the dwindling support for the Ukrainian war in the first place. You know what I mean? Like supporting Ukraine has become like, you know, really like what are you actually going to achieve? So it seems like it's more kind of a PR stunt. Maybe they've provided some kind of technical support to SAF, or you know, there's, you know, there's a long history of that. But I honestly haven't seen like any credible reports and any credible information that of Ukrainians actually being on the ground and fighting alongside SAF. I mean, you know, because the first question that comes to mind, like, you know, you have a whole war going on in Ukraine. You really have the time to
Right.
actually, you know, come out to Sudan and help us. So it's a little bit, you know, it's more of a PR stunt. It seems like it, rather than being like an actual conflict dynamic.
You know, one of the other things I was hoping you could talk about, Mosaab. I mean, obviously, you know, the humanitarian crisis is terrible, but it does seem that there is a lot of sort of grassroots resiliency in the sense that people are really trying to organize to help themselves and help their neighbors, you know, however they can, as much as they can. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that because I feel like we hear the bad things, but we don't see how the people are really trying to organize themselves to grapple with them either.
Yeah, that's kind of a reflection of, you know, the movement in Sudan since 2018 has been something that's been rarely analyzed and reported on adequately. You know, it's also this thing of, you know, people are very adamant about, you know, color revolutions and the West coming in and trying to destabilize and everything, but they're not used to it was like the other way around, the US trying to keep, you know, the status quo with the existing military government, but the people kind of uprising, because the level of how widespread the movement was is mind-boggling. Like nothing like it has happened in Sudan before. So of course, even with the war, that doesn't just evaporate overnight. It's actually, it's seeped in to become like kind of the youth culture of communal volunteering, of protecting the neighborhood, because this was times when, Burhan's government as well as the RSF were like cracking down on neighborhoods and raiding neighborhoods, looking for protesters, killing protesters, all of this stuff. So it's almost like there's become a culture of very grassroots, each one teach one, each one protect one kind of mode of operation. And after the war, we started seeing that, where you have things like emergency rooms, you have things like shelters, you have all these things run by volunteers. But also in other places, like in Darfur, for example, you have IDP camps where there's millions of IDPs, and they've always been used to self-organizing. Political parties and like armed movements and the RSF, and everybody would try to kind of get them on their side, but their thing is very clear. Like, we have a community over here that's deprived of the basic rights and basic services, and we need you to bring that. Don't worry, don't try to come at us with any kind of political agenda or anything. Self-organized, horizontal structures, everything that you would like to see from a grassroots movement has kind of been, there is the element of from region to region, it takes on different forms. But in general, the idea of kind of grassroots solidarity, horizontal solidarity, has been a huge theme in Sudan since 2018. Because there's a legacy of that before then. There's been like since 1964, 1985, there's been these grassroots uprisings that have removed dictators. So this is kind of a continuation of that. But the problem is right now with this internet shutdown, these are young people in their neighborhoods, diaspora sending them money so that they can set up soup kitchens and stuff like that. But now with this internet blackout, like they're really raising the red flag, like this is a humanitarian crisis, and they're not able to actually do this, community level service and volunteering and stuff. So there is a huge legacy of that, and I think one day it will be written and that story will be told, adequately. But right now, with the war and the humanitarian disaster that's happening, people's attention is kind of a little bit elsewhere, rather than focusing on that. But there is, even when it comes to, ceasefires, the first ceasefires from the war were community efforts,
Mm.
like, youth, volunteers, along with the community elders, along with the tribal leaders and religious leaders, going to both sides, going to SAF and to RSF, and telling them that, hey, if this is a power struggle, go and fight in Khartoum and go to like fight military to military. Like, please don't bring this into our neighborhoods and into our towns and into our villages. So there's a lot of that. You're right, that isn't really highlighted as much. Like, we try as much as possible to do that coverage with a lot of the journalists and the filmmakers and stuff that we work with, but it's just the sound of guns and airplanes and artillery and stuff. It usually drowns out the sound of these grassroots actors.
Hmm. Well, as always, we really appreciate you being willing to join us and help us keep eyes on Sudan. Mosaab Baba, researcher, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you, Rania. Thank you, Eugene.